Hi and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Rennie and I'm a Human Resources and Training Specialist with the team at Evans Fall HR. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. No doubt we have a range of business owners, managers and employees tuning in. Whatever your position or reason for participating, I trust you'll gain some really valuable information about some of these challenging workplace issues and how to protect you and your workplace from unlawful behaviours in the future. In today's session, we'll be covering what is discrimination, leading into harassment and sexual harassment, then the very topical issue of bullying. Finally, we'll look at what you should do in the event that you have one of these issues within your workplace. We'll give you some strategies for how to handle complaints and conduct workplace investigations, and importantly, how you can create a positive workplace culture that's centred on respect and a value of diversity. At the end of the session, we'll be having a Q&A session. We will invite you throughout the course of the webinar to enter your questions into the bottom of the page, and we'll collate those and address them all at the end. The global movement of #WhatTimesUp and recently the local movement of #Now have brought the issue of discrimination, sexual harassment and workplace abuse into the spotlight. Irrespective of your personal opinion on these movements, as they are very polarising topics, the reality is they have driven change in our workplace landscapes. People are more informed than ever about what constitutes inappropriate and unacceptable workplace culture. As such, victims are having the confidence to speak out, which subsequently forces employers to take action. What does action mean, I hear some of you asking? Well, obviously you must respond and deal with any complaints or accusation made regarding behaviours within your workplace, but more importantly, you need to take action to prevent these behaviours from occurring in the first place. And you can't do that without getting a greater understanding of what it all means. There are various pieces of legislation which cover conduct in the workplace, and we'll be looking at some of those today. These include the Equal Opportunity Act, the Fair Work Act, Sex, Age, Disability and Racial Discrimination Acts, Work Health and Safety Act, just to name a few. Interestingly, some of these legislations cover more than one type of workplace behaviour. We'll talk about that further in the webinar. So what is discrimination? Obviously a very powerful word and a word many of you have heard before, but I think understanding what it means in terms of the employment landscape is a challenge. So technically, direct discrimination is defined as disadvantaging and treating people less favourably due to a trait or personal attribute. So personal attribute is really the key word here, and they're specified further under the Anti-Discrimination Act to ensure individuals or groups are not treated poorly as a result of this particular attribute or trait that they might have. And I think it's really important for you to understand what we're going to talk about today, to understand what those attributes are. They are protected under the Act, and anyone can file complaints under the EEO Commission or through WorkCover if they believe they've been discriminated against under these acts. I've used some pictorial images because I feel like that's a bit easier for you to take away and remember some of these attributes. The first picture here represents culture. We see Waleed Ali, who some of you might know from television media and also a Gold Logie winner. He's pictured with his wife, Susan Garland, who is an Australian academic, author and feminist, best known for her ongoing work in regards to women in Islam. So that image is representing culture. This image was a powerful moment in Australian history when Nicky Winmar, an Indigenous footballer who played for St Kilda, who'd been getting a barrage of abuse regularly, but on this day it was particularly bad. He kicked a cracking goal, I believe, for memory, against Carlton in the early 90s, and as a result turned around and showed the crowd the colour of his skin, saying, you know, I am the man, but don't forget this is my heritage. And that picture represents race, which is also a protected attribute. The gender symbols, it is illegal to discriminate against people based on their gender, whether they are male or female. This picture here represents religion, obviously the cause of conflict all over the world and no different in the workplace and in the community at large. So obviously that is a protected attribute. This image represents age, which is a protected attribute. I've chosen this group of very happy looking older people, but age can work the other way. You can have ageism or discrimination against younger people as well. The late great Mr. Stephen Hawking represents disability and impairment. Magda Szubanski, who many of you would know, she was she's an Australian comic, but she's also representing their sexuality. Magda's a lesbian and was quite vocal in the Gay Vote Australian marriage movement. Also, the next image is in regards to transgender status and gender identity. This is a very challenging issue for a lot of workplaces and employers to deal with in terms of bathrooms and trying to provide support, knowing what to say. It is a challenge, but those who are identifying as a transgender status are actually protected under the Act. This image is of Catherine McGregor, who was an Army colonel who became a woman in 2012 and is now a group captain at the RAAF Reserve. It's a photo here of Christy Marshall, who breastfed famously in Parliament. Breastfeeding is one of the protected attributes. This image here shows carer's status. So just to be clear, the difference between carer's status and parental requirements, carer's status is generally specified under the Act as somebody who requires medical support. So it could be that you're providing care for someone with a special need. You might be providing care for one of your elderly parents or a family member who requires assistance. A protected attribute, and Miss Hanson, represents political positioning or political beliefs. Pregnancy is also a protected attribute. I was once asked in my late 20s during an interview process whether or not I was planning on having children in the next year or two. Obviously, that was discriminatory. I explained to the employer at the time that they needed to employ me as their HR manager so I could help them not make mistakes like that in future interviews. This image here of Shrek represents physical appearance. So depending on various physical attributes that a person may have, they may not be discriminated against due to these characteristics. This picture represents trade union or employer association activity. So whether you are a member or are not a member is covered under the Act. This symbol here represents HIV or AIDS status, which is also a protected attribute. Irrelevant criminal conviction. So obviously there are some situations where criminal history would be an important factor in determining someone's suitability for a job, particularly if, for example, if you were working in an area where there were children and you weren't able to get a working with children check. There might be areas in the finance sector, depending on what the nature of your criminal history relates to. But you cannot just be blatantly discriminated against because you have a criminal conviction. It must be relevant to the job at hand. And finally, marital status, including whether you're a de facto status or single status. So whether you're married or not is something that you cannot be discriminated against in the workplace. Indirect discrimination is something that is just as important as direct discrimination, but not as obvious. There aren't these really obvious protected attributes that guide us along the way to know whether we're doing the right thing. It's defined as a practice and condition or requirement that applies to everyone, but inadvertently disadvantages an employee. It may not be lawful if there are constraints on the business. Some typical examples of indirect discrimination might include having meetings after work or before work, all meetings. So, for example, if people have got parental commitments, that might be disadvantaging those people if they're not able to come to work for a 7:30 meeting or stay behind at 6:30, 7 o'clock. Having a policy like no part-time employees is indirectly discriminating against people who, for whatever reason, due to study commitments, maybe primary carer commitments, that they can't work full-time. Even dress codes can indirectly discriminate against people because they might not factor in particular religious requirements that require people to dress in a certain way. I know myself from working in a variety of organisations and spending some time overseas working that even determining when lunch breaks are can be indirectly discriminatory if people need to have prayer time and need to use their lunch breaks at certain discretional times to help them deal with cultural or religious issues. When it's not unlawful is when there are factors that might constrain the business. So, for example, if I had a female clothing shop and I've got a change room, I might specifically decide that for privacy reasons, I need a female employee to work in that area. Similarly, if I was recruiting for the Australian Customs Department, I might want a female customs officer to conduct female searches and a male officer to conduct male searches. There might be situations where we need our employee to have a driver's license, in which case we might be indirectly discriminating against people who don't have a license or people who are under 18 years of age, which might prevent a huge population of people from applying for a role. But in those instances, it's not necessarily unlawful. Sorry, it was remiss of me to mention at the start of the session today, you can ask questions at any time. We will get to questions at the end of the session, but if you note at the bottom of your page, there's an opportunity there for you to type in some questions, and we'll allow at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session to address those for you. Racial discrimination. Racism is still the #1 form of discrimination in Australia, which really staggers me, to be honest. We promote our country and our community as being multicultural, yet 1 in 3 of us are still treated less favourably as a result of that. And, you know, I say to you all now, look around your office when you leave or when you're walking around the city having your lunch breaks. Think about your family and friends. 1 in 3 people are discriminated in their workplaces. So that really is an alarming statistic and something that really should give us pause for thought at the end of today's session. This next slide here, Emma Watson, who's becoming the voice of a generation really. She's a UN ambassador and feminist. And for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, also known as Hermione from Harry Potter series. But she said well, it's become quite a recognised statement of late. How can we affect change in the world when only half of it is invited or feel welcome to participate in the conversation? And I particularly like this statement for the latter part where it says all feel welcome. So certainly we can all raise our hand and say something, but I think this issue of gender discrimination is really getting us to think about men and women being treated equally in a workforce platform and given the same right to speak and given the same, I guess, platform to be taken seriously when we do speak. There is disparity in leadership in Australian workplaces. Only 46% of the Australian labour force are made up of women, yet only 25% are represented in leadership roles. And these are statistics. They're not just numbers that I've pulled out of thin air. There's still over a 17% pay gap existing in Australia. Very, very hard for me to resonate when I've got 3 children and say to my daughter that her 2 brothers are going to earn more than her, regardless if they're both doing the same job and they're both doing them equally well. That just because she's a female, she's going to get paid less than them for that job. Yes, the gap has slightly closed, but 17% is still a chasm in my opinion. Women have less superannuation because they get paid less. They're the ones that take time off primarily to care for children and raise those children. Yet again, this influences their superannuation and their earning capacity when they return to the workforce. They're generally largely disadvantaged and in most cases have to start careers all over again because their previous choices didn't allow for flexibility that having a family requires. You know, women make up 97% of early childhood educators. So if you consider that, and most of us with children will at some point or another put our children in childcare or sent them to kindergarten. So an employee with a Certificate 3 in childcare is paid approximately $20 an hour, whereas an employee with a Certificate 3 in metalworks is paid approximately $40 an hour. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that those working in a metalworks industry is a predominantly male-dominated industry, as childcare is for women. Just that pay discrepancy is quite alarming when you think both jobs are equally important. I'm not sure if you're aware of the expression affirmative action. Some of you will be. If you work in the government arena, certainly you would be. But affirmative action is about putting quotas into place for women to be represented in particular areas of business and, importantly, in management roles. And look, it's a debate, it's an issue for debate. Some people, as a HR practitioner, I do believe people should be appointed to positions based on merit and based on their capability of doing the role. However, I also recognise that only 25% of women are represented in leadership roles. So by having a quota through an affirmative action program, there's a really conscious movement by the organisation to recognise this disparity and provide better opportunities for women in those particular workforces. And certainly, I believe that those organisations become a more attractive workplace and somewhere that's going to draw a higher calibre of female employees to want to work in those environments. But let's focus on the positives. When we do employ more women and give women more opportunities in the workplace, we're getting a broader representation of the community. Ideally, then we're attracting more diverse clients. Women do tend to be good communicators and possess high levels of emotional intelligence, which is sometimes lacking in male-dominated leadership groups. I once had a colleague who was a very senior female consultant, and she was talking about images of people on a company website, and she said, I don't think I'd work with that business. I said, why not? And she said, they're all men. All of those photographs of the senior and executive level are all men. And she said, that tells me a little bit about that organisation and not somewhere that I'd be particularly drawn to work with. And I thought that was a really interesting observation and something that I hadn't thought of before. So it might be worth, for those of you who are at executive or business owner levels today, that think about the representation that you have across your business, and that might be something that you consider moving forward for recruitment down the track. Age discrimination. It still obviously occurs. I mentioned previously that it could occur with both younger people and older people, but traditionally it is older people that face age discrimination. And I think it's important to note that, you know, skills, knowledge and wisdom that come with age are highly valued in some cultures. I did a significant amount of work in Indonesia some time ago, and in Indonesian culture, people are actually promoted based on their age. So irrelevant of their gender or their contribution, their wisdom is seen as the most appealing contribution someone can make in the workplace. And it was so different from our experience here in Australia, and something that I found very interesting whilst I was working over there. Workplaces seem to rush to push their older workers into retirement, or in many cases use redundancy as an avenue for exiting people quickly out of the workplace, particularly if they don't fit an organisational stereotype, or they're less energetic, or perceived to be less flexible, they're perceived to be more accident prone. And I would challenge that. I think that we generally have higher retention rates from people in an older age bracket. They can become excellent workplace mentors and coaches for other employees in the organisation. And, you know, sometimes I'd say it's about the training approach. You know, often employers have said to me, oh, I don't want someone old because, you know, they're not very good with technology. And statistics shows us that that's actually not the case. And I would say as a trainer that often it's probably more in the way training is delivered around new technologies or new work practices that are just not good training practices. And that could impact a millennial as much as it could somewhere in an older age bracket. So I would challenge you to look at the people in your workplace and see those older people as a value. When you're advertising for positions, there might even be incentives through various government and local community platforms to employ people who are in older age brackets and give them opportunities. Discrimination does occur in recruitment. I'm sure we've all at some point heard a story from a family member or sadly experienced this ourselves. From a HR perspective, we really just encourage and support merit-based recruitment, as I talked about before. And to do that, if you have got clearly defined areas, which we call key selection criteria, it's much easier to make sure that a position is appointed based on merit. And they're things relation to the experience somebody has, the knowledge that they might require, the specific skill set, the qualifications, or the behavioural characteristics that they might need to be successful in the role. And when we talk about experience, that's a really important area to think about. Experience does not mean that you need to have had 10 years experience doing something. Often you're indirectly discriminating against people by attaching a number of years. Experience is really about the capability. Somebody could have 5 years experience and actually be a lot more capable of doing than somebody who's had 15 years experience. So be mindful of when you're advertising, making that experience meaningful. Knowledge and skills are fairly obvious. There's particular skills and knowledge that you'll need to be able to complete the requirements of the job. Make sure that they're relevant and that they're applicable. So don't ask for skills that just would be nice to know but have absolutely no meaning in the particular role you've asked the person to complete. Again, I would challenge you to think carefully about what qualifications people require. Is a degree really necessary? Perhaps it is because of the idiosyncrasies involved in a particular marketing qualification and somebody needs to have that level of knowledge. Or maybe 10 or 15 years counteracts the requirement to have a particular qualification. So that is certainly one that you need to think of carefully. Behavioural characteristics, they are the area that usually cause people the greatest headaches. But they're what we require in the individual qualities that we're looking for in the person. We're looking for somebody who's driven, who's got attention to detail, who has good time management skills. They're highly organised. They can work well under pressure. We don't want someone who's got a good personality or who's fun. How do we measure what a good personality is? What I think is a good personality and what you think could be completely different. And that's when they're not measurable, and this can lead to interpretation of discriminatory behaviour. So we need to be really careful that some of those things are very clear so that you don't get yourself into a situation where you get later accused of not appointing someone based on a protected attribute. Unconscious bias. You might be familiar with the term, but not necessarily what it means. But unconscious bias is learned stereotypes that are automatic, unintentional, deeply ingrained, and are really able to influence our behaviour and our attitudes. Often our unconscious bias are really difficult to control, and they can be more damage than conscious prejudice because we don't always recognise that we're doing it. The way we've been raised, the suburb we grew up in, the school we went to, the way that the attitude of our parents or other people in our family that we listen to, it can be really challenging. But I like to give you a little bit of a challenge. Look around your workplace. Is it full of people just like you? Do you have a good representation of the community? Hopefully that you do. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, stereotypes do shape our perceptions of other people and what their capabilities might be. The way people dress can even shape our perception. So I would challenge you to move past that and try and control your unconscious bias as much as possible. In a recruitment setting, the best way to do that is to make sure that you get other people's perspective to balance your own prejudice. So you can do this in pairs. For example, try and choose someone very different from yourself. We like to say in recruitment that you should have, a gender balance when you're doing a recruitment drive, or you have someone from different age groups, different cultural backgrounds, just so it's not just the same type of people being recruited in the organisation based on one individual perception. I remember having a job very early when I started my career in HR, and my manager said at the time that the first thing he looks at when he was recruiting was what school the person went to, what secondary school, because it was really important for him. He was trying to target people from private school backgrounds. And I remember being so shocked at the time at his attitude, the fact that he openly admitted that to me, but also how limited his approach must be when I looked at my background and the background of my other friends and people that I held in really high regard, many of whom didn't go to private schools and were potentially being omitted from selection processes as a result of that. Okay, what is harassment? Again, a word that we hear a lot, but there is some confusion about what actually constitutes harassment in the workplace. So harassment is behaviour that is not wanted or asked for, makes another person uncomfortable in any way, usually leading them to feel intimidated, humiliated or offended, or it's because of one of those protected attributes which we showed the images of earlier. Harassment may occur as a single incident or more commonly as a series of incidents. Now, statistics tell us the story. 37% of Australian workers report being sworn at or yelled at. 22% of workers report being physically threatened by patients or clients. 11% of workers experience unfair treatment due to their gender. And almost 20% of workers say they've experienced discomfort due to sexual humour at work. These statistics came from the WorkSafe report last year and really reiterate to us that harassment does happen every day in the workplace. So harassment does include, I think I really need to at the moment just give you some clear outline of what does constitute harassment and what is not harassment. So harassment may involve inappropriate actions, behaviours, comments or physical conduct that is objectionable or may cause offence. And the Commission looks at it as what a reasonable person would cause offence. And unfortunately, it's very hard for people to understand what a reasonable person would think. But to give you some further detail around that, a reasonable person would assume that jokes, innuendo, ridicule or verbal abuse would constitute harassment. Creating or spreading rumours about a person would be considered harassment. Making insulting comments or jokes that group particular stereotypes about particular cultures or religions or genders, gestures, sarcasm, criticism, or insult that are designed to humiliate someone, or just making derogatory comments in general. These can all be perceived as a behaviour that constitutes harassment. What is not harassment is setting realistic standards of performance and requesting improvement to work that's not up to standard. I think this is a real area of confusion in the workplace at the moment. A lot of employers are frightened to sit down with their employees and conduct performance management or counselling meetings because they're worried about being accused of bullying or harassment. There is a clear difference between the two. I guess where the line gets blurred is if a manager is sitting down and giving feedback to an employee about their standard of performance and they're doing it in a derogatory manner, or they're using inappropriate language, or they're yelling at the employee while they're delivering this information, that's when the behaviour becomes harassment. But the actual act of managing your employees, which is the job of a manager, and to ensure that they're behaving according to the required standard, that is not harassment. Sexual harassment is unwelcome or unwanted behaviour of a sexual nature, which again is likely to offend, intimidate or humiliate an individual. Usually this type of harassment occurs in 3 different types of scenarios. The first being verbal harassment. Some examples, just to put it into context for you, this might include asking questions about a person's sex life, unwelcome pressure for sexual favours, explicit phone calls or text messages, humour, suggestive jokes or smutty comments. These would all constitute verbal harassment of a sexual nature. The physical harassment includes staring or leering at an individual, touching someone, patting someone, explicit contact or pinching. This doesn't mean that you can't open the door for somebody, or if you put your hand on someone's shoulder or the side of their arm whilst you're talking to them, that it's necessarily an act of sexual harassment. What is important is we communicate with one another. If you are offended at the fact that somebody has touched your back as they've opened a door, or that they've touched your arm in what might have seemingly been an innocent gesture, then our obligation as individuals is to tell that person that makes you uncomfortable. I realise that can be a very confronting and awkward conversation to have, but someone is not going to know that they're doing something that's offending you or upsetting you unless you tell them. So generally our advice would be is to try and prevent these behaviours from escalating at a local level, is to encourage your employees to be articulate with their colleagues to let them know when the behaviour's been inappropriate. If as an employee you don't feel confident to address it with the person directly, you should go to another person in the organisation or a supervisor and let them know so that they can approach the employee to let them know. I've worked in some organisations where employees are hugging each other and kissing each other, but this was in an organisation where it was part of everyday conduct. The employees were friends. It wasn't inappropriate. For them, it was just part of the greeting of the way they would address each other each day. So it can be difficult depending on what the culture of the organisation is. The only way it could be managed is if people speak up when they're in a position where they feel uncomfortable. The final category there is written harassment or sexual harassment. This might occur in regards to posters or screensavers, jokes or things that are circulated via email. We've all heard stories about people being terminated in roles where they've accidentally sent an inappropriate joke or pictorial image to the wrong person. But you know, we have to remember what's a joke to one person is not always a joke to another person. And you need to remember this is a workplace environment, and your work computer should be used for work purposes and not for you to be able to send around jokes to your friends that might embarrass or intimidate other people. Jargon on clothing also comes under to visual sexual harassment. I've had to send people at home before that have had images or statements printed on their t-shirts, which again might be seemingly innocent to somebody but could be highly offensive to other people. So again, just a reminder, it's a workplace. If it's something that you would wear to the beach or to a party with your friends, maybe you need to think twice about it when you're putting it on for work. Sexual harassment, I think this is really, really important, does actually impact both men and women. Yes, the statistics are high. The Australian Bureau of Statistics reports that 1 in 2 women are victims of sexual harassment throughout their working lives. However, 1 in 4 men also experience harassment. And I think this is a really important statistic to remember. Because men should be given the same level of respect and opportunity for reporting complaints as women would. And I think as managers, we need to be just as mindful that this is happening to men and women in our workplace. I coined this catchphrase a little while ago, and some people that I was working with enjoyed it at the time. So I've shared it with you today. If in doubt, don't let it out. And basically, what I'm trying to get people to think about is harassment and sexual harassment of a verbal nature are often based on the other person and the impact it has on them. It's not your intentions. And I think this is a really hard thing for people to grapple with. You know, living in a nanny state with political correctness gone mad. But in actual fact, if it's offending someone, it's not appropriate. And people need to take responsibility for that. The absence of complaints is not necessarily an indication that no harassment or discrimination is occurring. If you overhear something, if you're a manager and you know that that's inappropriate or it could be crossing the line, you've got an obligation to follow that up and speak to that person and take some action. Just because someone doesn't object to it, it doesn't mean that they're not offended by the behaviour or that they're consenting to it. As I said before, these conversations can be extremely confronting for individuals, and I think that we're relying on the broader workplace community to advocate for those individuals at times. So if you hear something that you think shouldn't be said, or if you're aware of commentary or emails being circulated, then do something about it. If you're one of those people that does say something before they think, saying you were only joking or you've never had a problem before to someone, that's really irrelevant. Any comment that you make that offends someone, you need to be responsible for that. So if you are in doubt, don't let it out and think twice before you speak at work. Okay, this next topic, bullying, is something, again, with the movement that's happened both globally and now in Australia. Bullying has become more than ever a forefront issue that employers need to deal with in organisations. The Australian Education Department is doing a lot of work within our high schools, and really that needs to extend to our workplaces. We can't be saying to kids at school, these behaviours won't be tolerated, and there are rules in place to make sure people are protected, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're off to university and they come to our workplace and they're unprotected. That's not the case, and the legislation certainly states otherwise. Bullying is defined as when people are repeatedly and intentionally use words or actions against someone or a group of people to cause distress and risk their well-being. Just let that word well-being sit with you for a minute, because bullying does harm a person's health and well-being, both physically and psychologically. I mean, some people actually don't ever recover from psychological bullying experiences they've had. And I am a very strong person myself, but I can say in my younger years, in my early years of working, I was definitely bullied at work by another female supervisor. And the way she treated me at the start of the day would shape my entire day. And I was on a knife's edge. It is a terrible work environment to be in when you're the victim of a bully. And hopefully by the end of today's presentation, a lot of us will have a bit more education and be a bit more mindful about what behaviours are going on in our workplace. So bullying behaviours can be very broad, but I've categorised them for the purpose of today's presentation into 4 key areas: victimisation, threats, sabotage and humiliation. So victimisation is treating someone less favourably because they've defended someone. Maybe they've been the voice of an individual, they've been a whistleblower as such, and as a result they've been the victim of a bully as a result. We absolutely cannot allow that to happen. Otherwise, there's no safety for people to actually report complaints, and we can't stamp out behaviours unless we know they're happening. So victimisation just simply cannot occur. Threatening behaviour constitutes yelling, screaming, offensive language, physical or verbal abuse, excessive scrutiny at work, psychological harassment or intimidation. Sabotage often refers to withholding vital information the person needs for effective work performance, giving employees impossible jobs, giving them unreasonable deadlines or constantly changing deadlines. And finally, humiliation. This could include excluding or isolating employees, giving them meaningless or unrelated tasks. I've actually heard people do that as a method of trying to exit someone out of the organisation. We'll just keep giving them meaningless tasks to do, and eventually they'll get so fed up they'll leave, which is just deplorable behaviour. It's if you've got issues about performance management or you need to exit people out of the organisation, there's ways and means of doing that without degrading an individual, putting them down or unnecessarily criticising them. Cyberbullying is something, again, that is very prevalent in secondary schools. It's the most prevalent form of bullying occurring with young millennials today. You know, school campaigns are actively having policies around this and making, you know, what constitutes appropriate commentary on people's socials. This has to extend to our workplaces as well. You must have policies in place to ensure that people are not permitted to make reference to individuals at their workplace that are derogatory, that they can't make reference to managers at their workplace, and importantly, that they can't do brand damage or impact the reputation of your business on their social media account. Yes, it is their personal account, but once it's out there in the World Wide Web, it's accessible to many different people beyond just their immediate intended recipient. There was a recent case involving a senior staff member at the Prince of Wales Hospital where this employee was terminated for posting something on Instagram of a sexual nature in relation to another employee. The other employee did not work in the same department, however, was made aware of the message. The person was terminated and claimed unfair dismissal. The dismissal was upheld by the Commission as they deemed that his behaviour by posting the message was objectionable, highly offensive and unwelcome to that employee. And therefore, it was deemed to be bullying behaviour of a sexual nature. Why does bullying occur? Well, there's a number of different reasons that bullying occurs. I mean, old-fashioned or autocratic management styles, which simply almost like a military style management, doesn't really work in most modern workplaces today. But they're sort of the, do as I say, not as I do scenario. They tend to really foster an environment of a bullying culture. When people are under excessive stress or they've got workload pressures, they tend to pass on that pressure to other people, and that can manifest in the form of bullying. Sometimes just organisational culture, depending on what the nature of the industry, in sales environments, brokering business, areas where there is, building environments. It sounds like I'm stereotyping. I'm not. I'm sure the statistics would support that there are areas where high levels of bullying do occur. But some cultures just foster it. It's ingrained from the leadership of the organisation. So sometimes when it's coming from the top, it filters all the way through to all levels of the business. This goes on to the next point of poor leadership supervision. Perhaps leaders of the organisation are not actually even aware of what they should be looking out for. They're not aware of, is that bullying? Oh, just speaking to someone in a rude manner or using swear word, that's not bullying, surely. So sometimes leaders not knowing where the line is can be the issue. And without a doubt, from my perspective as a HR practitioner, when people are escalated into managerial positions without necessarily having any training on supervision or leadership of people, this results in a very common occurrence of bullying behaviour. Either that they don't have the skills themselves to identify bullying, or they themselves are behaving in a manner which may constitute bullying because they simply haven't had the education to prevent them from doing otherwise. The cost of bullying to an organisation is massive. Some of the costs are really obvious, and some of them not so obvious, but can have a devastating effect to individuals and their families. From an employer perspective, obviously the existence of bullying can create a really toxic company culture. It can lead to high employee turnover, and as we all know in business, recruitment and training is a very costly exercise. So losing employees unnecessarily to competitors is something that none of us should be working towards. It's a breach of legislation, obviously. Bullying is a fairly unique issue in regards to employers can make claims under a number of different pieces of legislation. It can be covered under both Fair Work and Work Cover, and employers have got opportunities to make claims in different areas. So companies can be liable for the actions of their employees. However, if the organisation has shown that they've taken all reasonable steps, then their vicarious liability can be reduced but not completely omitted. There's also accessional liability. So if a manager is aware or should have been aware that conduct was occurring, then the manager is considered in some ways to have consented to that behaviour, and they can then be penalised under legislation as well. Obviously, there's fines for organisations, public condemnation. We do hear about this a lot. We read articles in the paper, or we hear about things happening with particular chains of organisations, and it does impact us as buyers and as consumers, and we're not as willing to give our business to those organisations. Obviously, it results in absenteeism or presenteeism, which is worse when the employee's turning up to work, but they're just not engaging in what they're doing. The cost to the employee, on the other hand, can be more lifelong. Severe psychological and emotional distress, anxiety, depression, incapacity at work, loss of self-esteem, and, very distressingly, this can lead to self-harm. It's reported that 1 in 100 workplace victims either attempt or succeed in committing suicide as a result of workplace bullying. And I don't know about you, but to me that is just utterly unacceptable. There was a recent case that's just been through the coroner's court in July of this year, where a woman who recently committed suicide, the the inquest found that the management in the organisation did not behave reasonably and had bullied the woman at work. The employee was ridiculed and humiliated at a meeting by her manager and took her life the very next day. And her psychiatrist stated that her actions were a result of a critical event, which had been, in fact, the public humiliation she'd faced at her work the day before. So, we all go to work because we've got mortgages and we're trying to pay for our lives and contribute in some way, in a meaningful way to society. I don't think any of us would ever want to think that we've been privy or part of somebody trying to hurt themselves or take their own lives. And I think we need to accept the responsibility that bullying can contribute to those sort of devastating outcomes. So please be mindful of that and have some thought about that later on today when you're thinking about this webinar. Handling complaints. Well, it's very important that we've got a process in place in our organisation. Make sure you've got someone that people go to. I mean, ideally, you should have a policy in place. The policy should say who people go to make a complaint or to talk to about an issue that they have. When you identify who that person's going to be, make sure that they're a suitable person. They should be an open and fair person, someone who's got a really high level of interpersonal skills. They should be able to demonstrate empathy, and certainly someone who's able to maintain confidence. They're all really, really important. We have informal and formal resolutions. Informally is obviously, as HR practitioners, we always want to resolve these at an informal level where possible, and that's when we encourage the employee to tell the offender that they've objected to certain behaviour and that they don't want it to be repeated. There might be instances where they don't have the confidence to do that, and that conversation needs to be done by a manager or somebody else. A formal resolution is when an investigation is conducted, usually for more serious matters, and conciliation may occur. This may result in termination or some other form of disciplinary action against individuals. As I said earlier, it's essential that victimisation doesn't occur, and also, very importantly, every policy should have some sort of commentary around people making false complaints. Accusations of bullying or harassment can actually destroy people's careers, and it's not a matter that we should be taking lightly, and not a matter where people feel that they can take action against someone for any reason other than a legitimate case of bullying or harassment. So I would urge you to have some consequences in place to ensure that people are deterred from making frivolous complaints. Okay, what can you do moving forward? Let's make this positive. Obviously, developing and communicating quality values. I still work with people now where they say, I don't know what our values are. I think they're on the wall somewhere. It's not good enough. Your values should really speak about how you want people to interact with each other and how you want to treat each other in a professional environment. We often have values for our clients. We should have values for the way we treat each other as well. So I'd encourage you to do that within your business. Developing and implementing a code of conduct it's like having workplace rules. Okay, schools need them, workplaces need them as well. We all come from different backgrounds, and we need to be reminded of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in the workplace. Establishing and promoting a zero tolerance workplace culture is essential. It's anything from zero tolerance to discrimination and bullying through to just zero tolerance of drugs and alcohol use. It's basically the organisation saying, if you seem to be found guilty or if you breach policies relating to these areas, the organisation will not tolerate it and you will be terminated. And this is really the biggest deterrent that you can ever put in place to try and create a positive workplace culture. Really essential that your managers are leading by example. And that's sometimes very difficult to challenge leadership behaviours and to sometimes make people really reflective at a senior executive level about the behaviour of their organisation. You know, we conduct engagement surveys on behalf of some of our clients to try and get a real feed from their organisation, from the employees, about how leadership and managerial behaviours are interpreted in the organisation. And that can be a really effective way of determining where training needs to occur for managers. But certainly developing that leadership capability is the responsibility of the senior stakeholders of the business. You need to have policies in place to ensure that people understand what the guidelines are. At the very minimum, you should have an equal opportunity policy. You should have a policy around bullying, harassment and discrimination. You should have a dispute resolution, and that basically stipulates what I said before, what people should do in the event that they've got an informal complaint, or if they've got a formal complaint, it will stipulate what the process is. And finally, you should have a counselling and disciplinary procedures. And the disciplinary procedure is very important. This puts in place, step by step, what you're going to do in the event someone in your workplace has been behaving in a manner that constitutes your contradicts your policies. You must have that disciplinary procedure in place to support your actions. Make sure your policies are reviewed annually. This is really important. And make sure employees receive a copy and sign off that they understand and acknowledge those policies and agree to work within the policy. That way, a breach is really easy for you to follow up because you've got an acknowledgement from every individual. It's really important that you conduct training in your organisation. You can have specialist training for your managers. Obviously, they need to understand what type of culture you're trying to create and what behaviours are inappropriate before they can ensure that they're overseeing the behaviours of the employees. We also do a lot of training at an induction level, or perhaps if you're inducting people at different times and you do sporadic recruitment, annual refresher courses can be really worthwhile. Creating a positive work culture is what we're all working towards. That's why most of you have tuned in to the webinar today. And being the fun police, that's sometimes required to create a positive workplace culture. It's really hard to say we need compliance in our organisation. But, it's not fun if people are leaving work at the end of the day feeling humiliated, if they're feeling embarrassed, if they're feeling discriminated against because of their religion, or people are making fun of them because of their gender. That's not fun. So, yes, sometimes the role does require us to wear that hat, but you need to do it. It's part of your obligation as a manager or leader of the business, or just a concerned colleague. We need to look after each other at work. The benefits that you will have by creating a respectful workplace: you will become a more desirable place to work. Your employees will work more harmoniously and more productively, which leads to better collaboration. You'll have talented individuals that want to stay in your business. They'll want to come to your business. You're likely to get an edge on your competitors, and you may even attract a whole new range of clients because of the culture you're creating, because you've got a balanced representation of people in the community. So, understanding this legislation and applying it in your workplace will automatically result in a more respectful and positive workplace culture. Now, I am keen to move forward because I can see a lot of questions have come forward, and we've only got 5 or 6 minutes left. So I'm going to try and address some of these issues for you now. Mandy has asked, I have to travel to work for work functions. Yes, legislation in regards to discrimination, harassment and bullying does occur before work, after work, on conferences. Anything that is related to work, the legislation still applies. So it doesn't turn off at 9 o'clock, turn off at 5 o'clock. I often say, even if you're going to take work photos at work functions, do it within the first hour of a function, then the phones go away, you're there to have an event, but people are still reminded that they need to behave in accordance with the company policies. And it is really important that organisations send out an email reminder before an event, reminding people it is a workplace function. You want everyone to have a good time, but they need to behave in an appropriate manner. There will be alcohol available for consumption. If they choose to consume alcohol, they must do so being mindful of their own behaviour. So just remind people. You might have functions and events all the time. You can never remind people too much, because all you need is that one incident for things to really go pear-shaped and impact any events moving forward. So Mandy, I hope that addresses your query. Carlo has asked, I manage a team and sometimes I need to give feedback and performance manage them. How can I do this effectively without accusing them, but being accused of bullying them? Well, Carlo, this is challenging, and we did touch on it earlier, but I think it's really important if you focus on the issues at hand. have a lot of anecdotal evidence to support why you're unhappy with their performance. Give them specific examples. Let them know in advance before the meeting why you want to talk to them. It's about your performance, and there's some areas I'm concerned about. No one wants to hear that they're performing badly, but if you go about it and communicate in an even-toned, professional manner, then the employee just has to deal with it. It's when you engage in heated debate, language comes into play, you start arguing with the employee. There might be occasions where you just need to stop a performance discussion and say, look, you're getting too emotional today. Go and have a break. We'll come back and talk about this again in an hour. Do whatever you can do to remain in control, because as the manager, that's what you need to do. But sitting down and having a constructive performance discussion with an employee is not bullying. James has asked, in creating a job ad, are there any tips for avoiding age discrimination and how we can specify experience requirements? Well, certainly with discrimination, don't specify genders, or, I've seen an ad once that said would be perfect for mums with in between school pickups. And I thought, that's just ridiculous. There's a lot of people who'd like a part-time job that finishes at 3 o'clock. We can't be targeting school mothers. We can say would suit somebody looking for a shorter work day, 3 o'clock finish. I guess it's implied, but we're not stating it in that regard. Also, using the word junior, we can't use the word junior unless junior award rates are applying. So be very mindful of saying we're looking for a junior employee. So unless you're actually paying someone as per an award a junior rate, then that's implying that you're looking for a younger person. You could say that if you have a graduate program that you're targeting graduates, but otherwise you can't just say that you're looking for graduates, because you could have an experienced person who's been out of work for 4 years who's even more capable of graduate. Why are you overlooking those other people? And in terms of the experience requirements, I prefer terminology like demonstrated experience, or must have extensive experience at a senior level managing, a portfolio of accounts. So there's other ways you can say that without specifying a number in front of it. Matthew's asked, what are some of the strategies to ensure when we interview candidates that we select and make decisions based on merit? Well, Matthew, in the past, what I've always done, as I said, I always interview in pairs, have a structured number of questions. And when we do a good interview, we do 2 things. One, we've got a set number of questions that we ask every candidate to ensure that everyone's being asked the same question, given the same opportunity to answer those curly questions. And then we have specific questions we might delve into the person's resume to ask specifically about them. But what we might have against the actual question sheet is a ranking, where we might actually rank how well the person, look, it could be something really simple between 1 and 5. 1, they failed that question miserably and weren't able to answer it at all. 5 being excellent response, exactly the answer that you would hope for. And maybe throughout the interview, you can just circle those, or do it tactfully, of course, or maybe directly after the interview, you might complete that. And that can be a really good yardstick to look back at and help you compare candidates against each other. But certainly interviewing in pairs provides a real support in making sure that you're making merit-based decisions. Claire has asked, what do you do if your workplace culture encourages inappropriate behaviour? Claire, I think some of us, I've directly worked in an organisation like this, as I'm sure some of the people listening today have as well. It's really hard, and sadly as individuals we can't change that. First and foremost, I'd encourage you to look after some self-preservation. If you think that that environment is truly toxic and not right for you, then you need to look for another job. Alternatively, if it's your dream job and it's just the people around you creating problems, then you need to try and start the process of change. You can do that in a number of ways, directly by going and speaking to someone. But ultimately, I think try and find someone in the workplace who's of a senior role who you think might be empathetic, and somebody who might be able to assist you in addressing some of these challenges. Because, look, it does happen, but it doesn't mean we should put up with it. And I would encourage you, Claire, to try and drive some change in your workplace if you can. Guys, we've only got time for one more question, which I'll address, that's come from Rima. I'm a senior member of the team, but do have concern about our CEO's behaviour. What can I do? Oh, Rima, terrible situation and really challenging. Look, as I said earlier, sometimes if you can do something like embark on an employee engagement survey where you can ask specific questions around the leadership of the organisation, we encourage people when we do that to have a section on the CEO or of the senior executive, so we can give them really specific direct feedback about how employees interpret their behaviours. A really confident CEO who may not even see flaw in their own behaviour is likely to say yes, because they think that they're going to generate a lot of positive feedback about themselves. Alternatively, you should approach other colleagues at your senior level, or you might need to go to the board and try and get some traction through the board about addressing this behaviour. But if you are a senior team member, Rima, you almost have an obligation to address this performance, because it's impacting not only you, it's likely to be impacting the people that report to you and a number of other stakeholders in the organisation. So I hope, Rima, that's given you some strategies about how you might be able to tackle this issue moving forward. Look, there's been a lot of other questions coming through. So obviously, there's people who are dealing with some really challenging issues in their workplaces. I hate to say no, but unfortunately, we've run out of time today. You can go to our website, and we've got some really fantastic ebook resources there. They're free for you to download. There's also a fantastic checklist we've got about equality and diversity. Maybe, Rima, you could print that out and pop it in the internal mail in an envelope for your CEO. Have a look at those. You will receive contact post this session today to give you an opportunity to request some further information. Or participate in some training with us. We actually offer training in the workplace for groups and teams, but we also do training at our head office where it might be appropriate for you to send 1 or 2 team members from your organisation to participate in a group session with others from other businesses. Either way, I hope to hear from you. There's leaving you with our contact information, but really interesting to receive some of your questions, and I really hope you got some value out of today's webinar. Thanks for joining with us. Bye-bye.